everyone. I'm Julie Follinsby. I work for the state of Vermont in the Agency of Natural Resources as a district wetland ecologist. My district covers Orange and Caledonia County, although over the years I've covered most of the state. And as a district ecologist in that position, anything wetland comes our way. So we don't separate the work that we do by the type of projects that we review, whether it's a violation or an ag project or a large subdivision or somebody wants to expand their garage, whatever it is, it's coming through that district person. So we see a wide range of activities, though depending on the district you're in, you may lean more towards residential commercial development, or up in the Northeast Kingdom, you're going to have a different sector that you're primarily serving. Today, I want to get through a number of things, starting with wetland identification, just give you some tips and tricks for trying to figure out if you've got wetlands on your lands, and then talking about the wetland rules and specifically what the do's and don'ts are as it applies to a lot of the work that you're doing with sugar makers. And when I say do's and don'ts, it's do proceed, you don't need a permit, or stop and let's talk about whether that's something that needs a permit. And I'll also talk about some other planning tools that are available to you for determining whether your project may need a permit or where to ask questions. And I've talked to my colleagues in the river management program at the state and gotten a couple talking points and some basics on their regulations for you as well, because there's a good amount of overlap in what they're asking for and what we're asking for. And I know somebody spent a whole 45 minutes this morning talking about discharges, but I just wanted to very briefly touch on that because I know it's something that has been coming up more often recently.
What do you mean by discharge? Hopefully you can be more explain.
I probably won't, unfortunately. I'm talking about discharges to surface waters and discharges to surface waters and wetlands. And it's still being defined in the Department of Agriculture, and the Agency of Natural Resources is looking at creating some best management and guidance for producers on what practices should be applied so that you're not creating a discharge that would be a problem, a violation.
Dumping sap, rinsing tanks and stuff like that.
Yep.
Hand acid.
Wash water, stuff like that. So some of our, and I'm sorry, we may cut off some of our slides here. I have no idea how to adjust that, so we've got to work with it. Some of our wetlands are really quite obvious. We've got cattails in them, there's sandy water, and other ones are quite a bit more cryptic. So I'm going to focus more on those more cryptic wetlands than the ones that you can fall into. In order for an area to be considered a wetland, it has to have three parameters: hydrology, hydric soils, and hydrophytic vegetation. And there's just one caveat to that, that if it's a disturbed land like an agricultural field with planted grasses in it, for example, you may not be able to rely on the grasses or the plants in the area. You have to focus on the hydrology and the soils. And for some of those cryptic wetlands, you're just asking yourself some questions. Am I mowing around the area? Would it take an excessive amount of draining or dredging to dry it out? Are the trees tipping over all over the place? Is it wet certain times of the year? So for wetland hydrology, which is really the key driver to whether an area is a wetland, what I commonly see when I'm out talking to people or hear that there's no surface water ever during the year. But in order for an area to be wetland, per the definition that the state and the federal government uses, it needs to have water within 12 inches of the surface for basically 2 consecutive weeks during the growing season. So you may never have that surface water. In fact, the water may be 11 inches below the ground year round, and it could still be a wetland. The wetland hydrology drives the type of changes in the soils, and those changes are the result of being in an oxygen-depleted environment. And so just, a very general rule of thumb is that your non-hydric or drier soils are going to be brighter oranges and browns and yellows. Hydric soils, those wetland soils, are those gray or black mucks or really depleted, or perhaps have a lot of kind of a gray background with brown or black streaking or mottles in it. So I'll just go through a couple pictures. So the ones on the left are your dry upland soils. The ones on the right are your wetland soils. And then for the plants, there's a national plant list which identifies nearly every plant that we have and indicates whether it likes dry feet or wet feet. And some plants are found in wetlands 99% of the time. Those are obligate plants. And then some are found in uplands 99% of the time. Many of our plants and trees and shrubs are found in some range of both. So for example, red maples sit right in the middle in that FAC area. Sugar maples are the facultative upland. So it's hard to see there, but 1 to 33% of the time, sugar maples will be found in upland. So they like dry feet. Sometimes you'll find them with wet feet. So the good news for you is that if you're tapping sugar maples, you're most likely working in a largely upland environment. So there's a lot of different wetlands, wetland types out there. These are some of the trickier ones to identify. You probably, maybe in other lines of work that you do or in other areas of your property, you might be encountering these wet meadows, these mowed fields that you tend to avoid certain areas because they're squishy, especially in the spring. In the forest, you may encounter this pit and mound topography where you have maybe your white pines or your hemlocks up on these little mounds. They like to have drier feet, and then you have these pooled areas or wetter areas in between. And when we're evaluating whether something like that is an upland or wetland, we're looking at where the predominance is. So we wouldn't break out each little tiny island. We would look at an area, maybe 100 by 100, and say, is this mostly wetland or is this mostly dry? This is a forested seep. The perspective, from where I'm standing anyway, you can't see it as well, but this is on a slope. Our seeps often are at a toe, or when you get a grade change is where they might break out, at the bottom of a bedrock slope maybe. And those are providing, they can be really important for cold water recharge to our streams. A lot of our wildlife, like bears for example, love these seeps because they green up pretty much first in the spring, and they tend to stay green later because of how wet they are. So they're good for wildlife feeding. And then vernal pools, which are critical amphibian breeding habitat, they may be present. These are those small pools scattered throughout the forest that may disappear, dry up entirely. So in the off season, later in July, August, September, it may just look like kind of a non-vegetated or partially vegetated depression in the ground, but come spring could be filled with amphibians. So in Vermont, we protect the 10 functions and values that wetlands have. Lately in the news, a big one is the storm and floodwater storage function. And so we've got towns like Middlebury that probably saved $300,000 in property damages from Irene. They've calculated just on the dispersion and the slowing of the flows coming through the Otter Creek wetland complexes during and after the storms. So wetlands can be really important for that, also for surface and groundwater protection, so water quality protection, as well as wildlife and fish habitat. So in Vermont, we protect wetlands that have significant functions and values, and they're protected under the Vermont wetland rules. It's important to note that the Army Corps of Engineers is a federal agency that is also responsible for regulating wetlands, and some municipalities also have zoning regulations around wetlands. So you could potentially, if you're working in a wetland, need 3 different permits to do that, you know, road crossing, for example. So in Vermont, we protect Class 1 and Class 2 wetlands. And it's when, you know, at the end of the day, it breaks down to the functions and values that they provide. And they have to have at least one of those functions and values that I had listed in the boxes, such as erosion control function. Class 1 wetlands are the highest level of protection. They have a 100-foot buffer. We only have a handful of those right now. We've added a couple more this year. And they are really those wetlands that are irreplaceable and have really unique or a high number and high level of function. Most of our wetlands are Class 2 wetlands, and those are protected by state rule. They have a 50-foot buffer. So most of the wetlands in Vermont are protected as Class 2 wetlands, and they have a 50-foot buffer. By definition, anything that's not a Class 1 wetland or a Class 2 wetland is a Class 3 wetland. So Class 3 wetlands are those wetlands that are low enough in function that they don't merit protection under the rules. Typically, they're smaller, often degraded maybe by land use or perhaps on the drier side of the spectrum. You know, so what mean to me? How am I supposed to figure out if my wetland is Class 2 or not? Well, this is the regulatory breakdown of our Class 2 wetlands. If it's on the VSWI map, and I will give you a very brief tutorial of what the heck the VSWI map is and where do I find it, then it's jurisdictional. Any of the rest of these on the list are presumed to be significant, so assume it's significant, and if you or maybe a consultant or someone from NRCS that you're working with is looking at it and saying, this is pretty crummy, you can give us a call, we can come out and take a look at it and evaluate it and let you know if it does merit the Class 2 protection or perhaps it would be a Class 3. So anything that's contiguous to a mapped wetland, which means it's connected to it, anything that is half acre in size or larger, and then these other special wetland types don't have a size threshold on them. So if it's associated with a stream or other surface water, if it's a vernal pool or something like a fen or a bog, it is presumed to be Class 2. But if you have them or you have questions about them, you want to do something to one, if you want to do something near them, give us a call. A big part of what we do in our position is go out and do site visits and walk land with landowners, talk about the project that they want to do. If you want to do a road crossing here and it's going to go through a wetland, we might spend a couple hours with you walking around, see if there's another way around that wetland that could work for both of us. If not, talk about what the permit process might be, what the likelihood of getting a permit would be. And then if you did need a permit and you came in for a permit, that same person who you were out walking around with is the person who would be reviewing that permit application and working through that with you. So we don't hand off a project that we've been working on to somebody new to scratch their head over. Yes?
I have a question. Bought land back in 1983.
Yep.
Roughly. Built a camp on it.
Mm-hmm.
Come to resell it. Now they consider that as wetland.
Yep.
So basically the land's worth hardly nothing. So what does the government do to the land? since it's gonna be classified as wetland, does the government give the landowner, you know what I'm saying? If you're buying, you know, when you're paying $2,000 an acre, you're buying 10 acres, and then all of a sudden the state comes in and says, oh no, this is considered as wetland, and your land's only worth $500 an acre.
Yep.
There's-
So there's not, in the wetlands program, there isn't a specific compensation program for a scenario like that. That said, I've worked with people who've had success going to their lister or their assessor in their town with a letter from us saying there is nothing else that can be done with this property beyond your recreation activities, and had success with getting that down. Some of these lands are also eligible in the current use program as special use or special treatment areas. And then there's a lot more, there are a lot more organizations now that are acquiring either intact wetlands, so people like the Nature Conservancy, or if they're degraded old agricultural lands maybe that aren't producing anymore, NRCS is also paying landowners to basically revert them back to their natural wetlands. So there's stuff like that. We can talk more after if you want some specifics. Did you have a follow-up question
No.
to that? Okay. So I mentioned before the 50-foot buffer zone. It's important to essentially protect those functions of the wetland. And for Class 2 wetlands, it is that 50 feet. And what that 50-foot buffer zone means is it essentially has the same protections as the wetland does. So we don't set different rules for what happens in the wetland and what happens in the buffer zone, but certainly if we were evaluating a permit and we had a choice of something happening in a wetland versus in a buffer zone, we'd probably be more encouraging for you to push it into the buffer zone if you couldn't keep it out. So you'll see this slide again. I'll get into the permits a little more, but basically any activity in a Class 1 or 2 wetland or buffer that is not an allowed use or exemption needs a permit. If it's Class 3, it's non-jurisdictional, and if it meets one of those allowed uses or exemptions, it doesn't require a permit. So what I want to do is walk you through some of the activities that you might be doing on your land and whether or not it would need a permit or ways you could avoid the permit. So aspects of maple sugaring that may be covered under an allowed use exemption. So we have an agricultural exemption, we have agricultural allowed uses, we have silvicultural allowed uses, and we have other allowed uses for maintenance type activities. And these aren't blanket exemptions or blanket allowed uses. There's some nuances to them, and I'll go through a few of them here that may relate to what you do. But very, you know, typically for allowed uses, they're low impact activities or they're land use activities associated with silviculture and agriculture. And if you're maintaining or repairing existing infrastructure. And that slide is just saying that unless it specifically calls for it in the allowed use, there's no draining, dredging, clearing allowed with those activities. And so this is just sort of the laundry list. We'll get into some of these as I work through these scenarios for you. So in terms of stand or crop cultivation for your sugar bush, the Vermont Wetland Rules allows for the sustained management of the stand. That said, your structures should be located outside of wetlands and buffers.
Could you define what that sustained management? I have an area like this, and I cut trees, but I thin out hemlocks around my maples because my maples come right down to.
You can, yes. Yeah. So some of the allowed uses that would apply to the work that you do are the silvicultural allowed uses under the rules. So it's for the sustained management, that's kind of the key there, not a clear cut for development, it's sustained management. So the idea is if you're cutting trees, it's for the health of the stand, it's for a specific purpose, and it will continue to be a forest when you're done. The silvicultural allowed uses, the keys are that new haul roads need to be outside of wetlands. If you're accessing land, whether this is the land that you're already working or you're looking to acquire new land and expand your sugar bush, those skid roads can go through wetlands. We realize that people cut in wetlands, and that's fine. But if you've got a whole lot of slash in there or other material that would create a fill situation, we want that to come out when you're done. So it would be a temporary fill. And again, your haul roads have to be outside the buffer zone or in the buffer zone, but not in the wetland. And the other thing is that landings need to be outside of wetlands as well. I said haul roads have to be out, but I've got, I'm working with a logger right now to put in a frozen, like an ice road basically, to do winter logging. So that is fine. It's the fill that's the problem. So that is rutting to the point of dredging right there. So if someone was working their land and it looked like that at the end of the day or the end of the job, get those ruts smoothed out. That is hard to see, but that is a slash pile that would constitute fill. So again, that needs to be distributed or removed from the wetland. So I talked a little about, so I'm going to go through a couple of slides. The yes column is yes, proceed, that would fall under one of our allowed uses or exemptions. The no column is would need a permit, talk to me. And I did leave business cards over there, I should say, if you want to grab it. I may not be your district ecologist, but you can start with me. The color handout that I gave you has a link to our website where you can find your specific district ecologist. But if you've got a question, you can always start with me and I'll help you find the answer or hook you up with the right person. So for new structures and facilities, they need to be located outside of wetlands or buffers, or they need a permit. And then if you've got one in there already that was there before 1990 or something that was an unmapped wetland before 2010, we had a rule change that brought in those other presumptive wetlands that I described, those unmapped wetlands that are over a half acre in size, the vernal pools, the wetlands along streams. Those, they're essentially grandfathered in if your structures were in before that. And so upgrading within the existing footprint or maintaining those is an allowed use. If you're clearing new areas around those structures, or you're putting new stuff in wetlands and buffers, or you're enlarging your footprints, moving things around, probably needs a permit, although there are some smaller expansions and relocations that we can consider under the allowed uses. So maintenance, I basically just went through the maintenance and repair of existing structures, but up to 250 square foot expansion or modification is allowed without a permit. We're currently working on some more kind of general permits or registrations, trying to expand the wiggle room, I guess, or the ability to permit around existing structures with a little more flexibility, but we don't have that set up right now. So access roads we consider structures as well, so those again need to be located outside the wetland and buffer. If there's no way to get to that nice upland part of your property without crossing a wetland, we'll work with you on that, but it probably requires a permit, and we'll work with you through that process. You can maintain and upgrade an existing road within the filled footprint. And if it's no longer identifiable as a road, I've seen some roads that, mean, I could be there, I could be here, it all looks the same to me. There are lines on a map somewhere, but it's not a road anymore, so that wouldn't qualify under the yes column. That would qualify under the need to talk about permit column. Sap lines, they're good, elevated on stakes and trees, laid on the ground surface, burying it through the wetland, grading or filling if you have to clear big corridor for access, that would trigger a permit review.
You can post temporary posts to the wetland, for example.
Yes, yep, that's fine. Like fence post type thing, yes, totally fine.
Is there anything that can't be used as far as posts or steel or?
At this point, we're not regulating them. So. And then there's activities, fish and wildlife activities and beaver removal, but the biggie that we run into is people's, the nuisance beavers. And so there's a substantial beaver best management manual. There's also a smaller version of it. But the long and short of it is that if you're following those BMPs, you can remove a problem dam that's less than 2 years old as an allowed use. The best management practices ask you to do things like lower the dam no more than a foot a day so you don't blow out your neighbor, do it correctly so that you're not causing problems downstream. And then if it's over 2 years old, you need approval from either the Wetlands Program or the Department of Fish and Wildlife. And we'd probably be asking for similar things, but evaluating whether at that point, if a dam is that established, if there's alternatives like beaver baffles. And there is seasonally during the warmer months when the beavers are active, Fish and Wildlife employs a beaver specialist who will come out and look at your dam. If you have a problem dam, they'll work with you to put in a baffle. I think the landowner pays for the materials, but they'll actually go out there with the shovel and spend the day with you putting that baffle in and figure out where to put it to that is going to work for you, that's going to work for the system, and that's going to keep the beavers happy. So the bottom line is you can manage your stand as long as you're not clearing for access, you're not installing structures, and you're not expanding your structures without a permit. So I've got a new sugar house I want to put in. I've got to cross this wetland with this road because I have 100 acres up there I can't get to. What does that mean? If you need to fill, if you need to dredge, if you're not an allowed use or an exemption, you need to get a permit. We have a couple different permits right now. As I said, we're working on expanding not the extent of regulation, but basically giving more options that would require a little less effort on the landowner's part. At the moment, we have a general permit, and very generally, it's for projects less than 3,000 square feet combined wetland and buffer. Yes?
Do you charge for the permit process?
We do.
Are there different rates or all one rate?
It's, there's an administrative fee that I think at this point is $250, and then it's 75 cents a square foot for wetland impact and 25 cents a square foot for buffer impact. So our consulting fee is nothing. I mean, you pay your taxes, so I'll come out and take a look at your property. And but if you need to apply for a permit, you're paying for the square footage of impact of that project. So the general permit, as I said, is anything less, well, most projects less than 3,000 square feet combined. It's not for, when I say after the fact, those are the violations. You put it in already, oops, let's get you back into compliance. We don't do general permits for after the fact. That would be an individual permit. The benefit to the applicant is that the process as a whole is shorter, but the key really, in my mind, is that there's less technical information required by the permit. So you don't need a detailed delineation. If it's pretty straightforward, if your edge of you had a project right here where this vest is, your edge of wetland is right at the toe here, it's pretty straightforward. You could throw a couple flags down, you could work up a sketch plan, and you could apply yourself. If you end up in an individual permit, because you're over that threshold, that requires a consultant to do detailed wetland delineation. They're looking at those three parameters, your hydrology, your vegetation, your soils, and there's also more detailed wetland information in terms of all the different plants that are there, and they would be helping you evaluate your impacts and work their way through the process with us. There's also a longer notice period, but I think from the folks that I've talked to, it's more about the background information that needs to go into the application and having to hire a consultant that is the bigger burden on these ones.
Yeah, if you have a piece of land and you got just 200 square feet, or not even that, of wetland, instead of swampy, bring a tractor down, and you actually dig a pond for deer, watering, birds, ducks, and everything, or do you need a permit?
So,
a small pond.
If it's very small, then it may be a Class 3 wetland and is not even regulated by us. If it is a Class 2 wetland and it's regulated by us, then the pond would need a permit. Okay. So regardless of what permit you come in for, the key to your application, really the meat and potatoes, is demonstrating that there's not an alternative that wouldn't have wetland impact or wouldn't have less wetland impact. And the first step essentially of getting a permit is to not get a permit if you don't need one. If you can avoid it, then avoid it. And if you can't, then your application needs to talk about, well, my road was going to go through the middle of the wetland, but we looked around and we found that we could cross on the southern end where there's already a house next door and we're just nicking the end of the wetland, et cetera, et cetera. So you're demonstrating that this is really the best that you can do under the circumstances. So the idea being that rather than, and this is kind of cut off a bit, but rather than crossing over here on this one, rather than crossing through the wetland to put your house way in back and then you've got your septic over here, you're consolidating everything down closer to the existing road, keeping all your infrastructure together, and even though you're going to have some buffer impact from that, you've tightened it up as best you could given the constraints of this property. And then I guess this gets in a little bit to the question of cost and what permit category you get into. That if you've got a project you want to put in, well, I'm meeting with somebody, I think they have a pump house or something they need to put in, but they have some flexibility. So we'll go out and we'll kind of walk along the wetland. We'll look at where the buffer is and we'll talk about what areas are outside of the buffer and where they might be able to site their infrastructure. I realize that with sugaring, you've got this downhill problem, right? So those low points of the land is where you're ending up at the end of the day. Those are also the places where your wetlands are and where your streams are. So there will be times that those permits are really probably unavoidable in terms of your operation. The key would be for new operations or expansions that you're really accounting for those before you start, because it makes your life a lot easier and will give you more flexibility in the long run. This image here, this was somebody who was siting a new sugar house, and they also needed septic for that. So they figured out where the wetland boundaries were in here, and they sited those things far enough away that they have the ability to expand in the future. They didn't jam that sugar house right up against that buffer in case their operation goes gangbusters and they want to expand that. Now they have more flexibility. And then this green map down at the bottom, that was a 500,000 tap operation that was just starting out. So they went into a much different level of permitting and also just assessment of their acreage and land to figure out where they could get all their infrastructure and be most efficient. So my recommendations are to, figure out where your wetlands are, and whether that's you having a good sense of your land, or you calling us to come out and walk around with you, or hiring a consultant if you would prefer to do that. If you can do your access that you need to do under frozen ground or temporarily, that's always beneficial, and then you're avoiding and minimizing as much as possible. Try to avoid that permit. And again, call us, use us, we are happy to help. We do about 600 site visits a year, so it's a big part of what we do, and it is no burden, it is a joy, especially when we go out and don't find wetlands. So I mentioned some tools earlier that we have. There's just kind of the basic flyers and handouts. I gave you the landowner's guide to wetlands. That's just a very short primer, but it's got some important links on it. I will briefly show you the wetland inventory map that I introduced earlier. We have some contact information forms on our website, and you can certainly use me as a starting place. And then we've got a lot of other additional information on our website, and you've got us. So you can call and talk through some of your questions if you're not quite ready to have someone come out and look. If you're not sure if you need someone out there, don't be shy.
What do you years ago found that your ponds
Yep. Well, that, in my mind, was a big reason for the change in the rules in 2010. We updated them in 2010. I was working over in Chittenden and Addison and Rutland County at the time, and I spent a good amount of my time regulating farm ponds because they were mapped, they were considered class 2, and then they were regulated. And then on the other side of the state, over in the Northeast Kingdom, in this area of the world as well, where it's heavily forested, our forested wetlands weren't getting picked up on the mapping. So we were protecting all the little farm ponds, and we weren't protecting our large, cedar forests. So the rule change now, those wetlands are still, if that farm pond was dug in a wetland, it's still protected, although there are ways to evaluate them and perhaps reclassify them, and it's a lot easier to reclassify a wetland that is essentially mislabeled. The other thing is we have an exemption now in the rule for ponds and other constructed features that were built in uplands. So if we can figure out that that pond is today entirely surrounded by upland, and it's obvious that it was constructed in an upland, then we can say that's an exempt feature, and even if it's mapped, we don't have to protect it, it's not a wetland. So we've got a couple outs. There's an easy out, and then there's at least a process that there really wasn't a straightforward, simple process before that. Right. Yeah. Well, the mapping is based off of the nationwide National Wetland Inventory map, and so it's a desktop map layer that's created from somebody who looks at maps a lot, looking at the various layers of topography and imagery and maybe soils to determine where it's likely that there's wetlands on the landscape. So the mapping is very imperfect. And in some cases, there's entire towns that have been shifted, like when they digitized the layer, maybe someone sneezed and scooted the map, because you can see every single wetland where it actually is on the landscape versus where it's mapped are all shifted the same degree. So
generally you find that you need to do the 2 layers of
they can treat it as a pond. So that was there forever, so they can keep doing what they're doing with it. And there's actually best management practices for pond maintenance. So if you have a pond, and the intent of those is that you're not dredging it out and then dumping all the dredge materials in the wetland next to it, right? So you're either putting them back on the berm, or you're putting it on the other side of the pond that's not in the wetland. But as long as the pond has been there and has been there since 1990, or at least since the 2010 rule change, then it's grandfathered and they can keep doing what they're doing with it. So we have the VSWI map. So remember that the mapped wetlands are jurisdictional, and anything connected to them, any wetlands that are directly connected to them, are also jurisdictional, as well as the unmapped wetlands that are scattered throughout the landscape. So we have, there's a couple different maps. I think you have a link to this on the flyer I gave you, the wetland inventory map. And if you go to this one, it turns on the blue layer, which is the mapped wetland layer, and the brown is the hydric soils mapping from NRCS. It's not telling you for sure that hydric soils are there. Their mapping is better than our wetland mapping, I would argue.
What do you mean by hydric?
So they have an actual category for poorly drained soils, or hydric
Yeah, where the
soils.
water directly seeping
It's
out of
where,
the
no, but it's where it's more likely that water will stay at the surface because it's either silts or clays and the water can't infiltrate well. So we often find wetlands where we have hydric soils mapped. So we tell folks that if you've got hydric soils mapped on your property, or if I'm looking at a map and I'm going out to the property and I see hydric soils, I'm betting that more often than not there will be wetlands there associated with those soil mapping because it doesn't drain as well.
So if you were going to purchase land going through a real estate, the realtor, is he going to tell you that it's considered as a wetland, or you got to look it up to see, are the realtor obliged to tell you that it's considered as a wetland, or do they don't say nothing and sell you the land and then you find out that it's considered as a wetland?
I think it's a little bit of both. Realtors, I believe, have a professional obligation to share information that they have about a property, but if they're not looking at this map, then they don't have the information, right? So they're not obligated. I don't know all the ins and outs of their profession, but we don't obligate them, and as far as I know, there's no outside bodies that tell them that they have to review this map before they
Now you
sell
know to
something.
ask.
But now you know to ask, and we do meet with them. We get together with them every couple of years, come and do a talk like this, basically, to say you should be, this is a help to your client. I know it can be problematic to have this information trying to sell a property, but in the long run, it's a lot less headaches. And some people are they're totally fine with this, because if you buy, this property to build something here, there's no one's coming in behind you, right? And there's still, depending on what you want to use the land for, there is still a lot you can do with it, depending on
Maybe
the
you like to
property.
watch Mondays.
What's that?
Maybe you like to watch Mondays.
There you go. So anyway, this is a great place to start. And I'm sorry the link is cut off, but you do have a link, I promise, in what I gave you. So the other map that is essentially the same thing, has the same layers, but you may find yourself here from a different angle, is the Natural Resources Atlas. And you could Google Vermont Wetland Map and you'll get there one way or the other. So all you need to do for starters is to put your address up in the search bar up top, and then down here where the layers are, once you zoom into the address that you want to look at, you can come down to this layers button, and you'll get a whole slew of layers here on the side, and you can find out all sorts of information with all different varying amounts of accuracy associated with them. But they've got river corridors and well locations, maybe rare, threatened, and endangered plants, as well as, what else do we have on here? You can find out where some animal crossings are, where streams are mapped. There's Act 250 permits. There's all sorts of goodies that can be found on the maps. And then, yeah, so this is just sort of an up-close vision. This is Montpelier downtown, well, just before you get to downtown Montpelier, so your properties may not be quite so lit up as this. It's not usually a good sign if everything's turned on where you're trying to go. So speaking of floodplains, I mentioned that I got some slides from my colleagues in the river management program. It seems as though there's some overlap generally with where our regulations lie and theirs. There's both a floodplain and a river corridor program. There's a good amount of overlap in what they do. Oftentimes we're also finding wetlands in our floodplains and river corridor areas, and those areas have a lot of similar functions and values as our floodplain wetlands. The key message that I got from them is that you may need a flood hazard area and river corridor permit for ag and silvicultural practices. So that would be your maple production and not so much, I guess, the production, but they lean more towards the structures as well. So your roads and structures are going to be regulated within the floodplain and the river corridor. And, okay, so the river management program also regulates stream flow, so water withdrawals, and the stream crossings, and that goes through the stream alteration permit. So for perennial stream crossings, you would need a stream alt permit. Go up towards the front, but the difference in where the river corridor and the floodplain area are can be minimal, or they can be quite variable. Floodplain is the special flood hazard area, so that's the area where the water might flood in a flood event, in a storm event. The river corridor is the area that a stream or river needs to adjust over time, and so they don't necessarily map in the same area on the landscape. And these are, for most of the state, these are mapped. And then for smaller streams, which is, I'm guessing more of what you all may be dealing with, there's a 50-foot river corridor setback for structures on smaller streams. So that 50 feet is fairly consistent across the board.
Can you do a temporary, like an annual, what is over the river? Without a permit? Through logs?
I don't know. But I gave you some contact information. And so the river corridors are mapped statewide. The small streams aren't mapped, but they're 50 feet. And then the FEMA, some of it is digital, some of it you need to get, depending on what part of the state it hasn't been digitized, and you need to get it from FEMA directly. Or you can talk to your floodplain manager and they'll help you find that.
Do you know
Yes.
how long those
The river, some of these are fairly new. Yeah, like I would say in the last 5 years. Yeah, I think if it's been there, I'm guessing they have similar grandfather information. Yes?
So where a river turns into a beaver pond, like a brook, then where it's a beaver pond, it's you,
Yes.
and where it's flowing water, it's them.
Yes. Yep. Which gets a little weird sometimes depending on the project.
Oh, absolutely. I can see that being a nightmare.
But when the state took over a lot of wetlands, mapping and stuff,
Yeah.
did they get funding from Ducks Unlimited or anything? Or did Duck
protection and restoration work in the state
Protections and land, is that just
of the land. Yeah, we're regulating, and Ducks Unlimited, we work with them. I've been working with them most recently on the in lieu fee program, which is a mitigation program for the Army Corps of Engineers, where for larger projects, they basically pay into a mitigation bank, and then Ducks Unlimited is creating large projects rather than doing, you know, fixing or improving small bits of wetlands on every project across the state. They're pooling that money and identifying big projects and doing bigger restoration type projects.
taking more
Well, the ones that I've seen aren't doing that. They're not very productive. They're looking for that non-productive land to protect and to restore. And then I promised I would say enough to be annoying on the discharges. And this is a message that everyone or no one can discharge without a permit per state and federal law. And that is basically disposing of your wastes on the land so they're not getting into your waters and wetlands. And if you went to the presentation this morning, you probably heard that the Department of Environmental Conservation and the Department of Ag are working to put some BMPs together for you all, so you have more information about what this means and what are you supposed to do about it. So stay tuned. I know they're actively meeting to come up with this. I don't know if you heard a schedule on when they thought they'd be
The
sending
guy
stuff
said he
out.
thought he would have data to give them in 2 years. He hoped that the regulations would wait that long, so that they could
So
be
in the
informed by
meantime,
back.
though, in absence of regulations, that they would have some guidance. Yeah. Yeah.
But as far as you're concerned, those discharges will go up.
Right. We don't want direct discharges. So you know, if you've got questions, but a lot of our wetlands do have surface waters, and we've seen some bad stuff happen from the wrong things, whether it's from a sugaring operation or other, I mean, there's household effluents and ag effluents, so we want it out of the wetland, and certainly out of the waters.
Is our own water considered a discharge?
Yes, I believe it is.
He was talking about using riprap in zigzag ditches and in the length of it, being able
Yeah.
to diffuse the.
So it's things like they're looking, it kind of comes down to whether there's, it's the dissolved oxygen level. So are you depriving the stream of oxygen by putting something in it? If you're heating it up, so I think the issue with the RO is the heat, that you're changing the temperature of the stream or the receiving water. All these presentations are supposed to be posted in the coming weeks back to UVM Extension's website, and so I urge you to look for that one.
So you're worried about discharge directly into some sort of waterway?
Yes,
But what happens if we discharge them just into a creek?
that's fine. Yep. Yeah. So I'd be remiss if I didn't say that could very well be other permits that apply to your project depending on what you're doing, particularly if you're, you know, doing something like a sugar house that may need a wastewater permit, a septic permit. So down at the bottom here, we have regional permit specialists. So they're in our regional offices, whether it's Rutland or Springfield or St. Johnsbury or Montpelier, who can answer questions about permits. So they'll sit with all those map layers up, and they'll ask you lots of questions about what you want to do, and they'll tell you if you need to talk to the Division of Fire Safety or if you need to talk to the wastewater folks. So if you are planning a project, I suggest you give them a ring as well. And one last time, I will tell you to call your district wetland ecologists. We're friendly, we want to help you avoid that permit, and have a successful project, so don't be shy, and I thank you for being here today, and I'm happy to answer questions. And if you have to run out, you're welcome to.
No,
Okay.
I'm cold.
It is chilly in here, yeah.
How long from start to finish to get a permit? So if I call you up this spring and say, I want to put a new road, looks like it's wetland.
The general permits are typically about 2 months. Individual permits usually run more in the 3 to 4 month. The individual permit has a 30-day public notice period. So you'd want to get hustling if it's something you want to do this coming construction season. It's sort of, you know, in Vermont we have a short construction season, so spring is a wily time for us, but you can give us a call and start talking about the proposal now, and so we can be primed to get out there. And
When you mentioned you were working on that, does that mean everything has been on or less than long? What is that?
we are working on some of them now. I know there's a general permit that we're working on for agriculture as a whole. I'm not sure, I haven't been involved in that, so I'm not sure how that would apply to sugaring, which is also considered an agricultural activity, but it's kind of ongoing. We're trying to make your lives simpler as well as ours. It's not just out of the kindness of our heart, it's for selfish reasons as well.
Your orange in California?
Yes, yep,
Who's Beaver?
it does.
I'm talking to you.
Wonderful. Sounds great. And we're happy to, if you've got a property that you're looking at that you're thinking about buying, for example, or for expansion, we can look at it, you know, we can do a desk review, or we can go out and take a look at it. We do that a lot, and I'd rather talk you out of something that's not going to meet your needs than pat your crying head on my shoulder. We want this to be as painless as possible. All right, thanks everyone. Drive safely. It was starting to rain a little bit when I came in, but it was still warm.
We need snow.